of letting her express the requirements of the project to someone who does in a way that person will understand. That's why we found the approach is much more highly successful, as we've been talking about in engineering, where it's much more deterministic
Okay.
than in building design, which is more artistic.
Hello, Anthony. Thank you to be there.
Yeah, my pleasure.
So I'm happy to have you here because it's a long time I hear about Hypar. Basically, to me, Hypar is a kind of toolbox where you have some small functionalities that allow to do very specific stuff, like, for example, generating a room or generating a stair or something like this. And you can combine the feature together to do exactly what you want. A sort of no code, but for construction, it's what I understood for architecture and construction.
Sure. So maybe I should talk a little bit about the history of Hypar, which will kind of explain it. So my partner Ian Keogh and I founded Hypar in early 2018.
Mm-hmm.
And what we first did was build a cloud platform that was appropriate for building AEC software on top of. And to that end, we published an open source elements library, which a bunch of companies use now in their software that we maintain. And so when you talk about, like, I think Hypar is this thing where I assemble an application. We're talking about the platform, which still exists.
Okay.
We have customers who create their own software on top of that side. But like most platform companies who have ever tried something like this in AEC, we also found that we needed our own application to sort of demonstrate what you could do on the platform and had its own strengths. So about a year and a half ago, we started working on a space planning application because we had done at least 4 bespoke space planning applications for private customers. And almost the entire team comes out of architecture, except for our one PE. We have 2 registered architects on our team as well. And so we, kind of went back after doing a lot of engineering stuff to our first love and started supporting architects, space planners, asset managers, and those kind of folks, with the idea that we will start layering in more disciplines when we feel like we've sort of nailed this workflow around space planning. But one of the important things, we got a lot of feedback on the platform, which was summarized best by people saying, guys, we love the functionality. It's a little hard to learn. And so what we did for our own vertical space planning application was just maniacally focus only on usability and try to make the thing as easy to adopt as we possibly could. So, what our goal, which it seems we've achieved by testimonies from our customers, is we wanted someone to pick up the application and be able to do something meaningful within 5 minutes. And independently, we've had folks come back and say, yeah, I gave it to my colleague and she was doing something in 5 minutes. And so we declared victory and, kept going. But it's part of the scrutiny that, as the chief product officer and my product manager, Kat Devenko, we really, really focus in on. I'm like, is this thing intuitive? And, to that end, when we first started down this road of this new application, we instituted a program of testing with prospective users, which we maintain to this day. We've done literally hundreds of 30-minute interviews and tests with architects in practice, and we record all of them and we show them to the engineering team, and we flag points in the recording to say, and they were struggling right here and they were struggling right here and they totally didn't understand what we were doing here. And so we have this recursive process where we're constantly testing new features with architects, revising them, testing them with more architects, and on we go.
Yeah, I think this is very important because in the AEC field, I have the impression that the software, the tool are not as polished as in other domain, and the culture of UI design is not as present than in other domains. So I think it's quite important to first to be differentiated from your competitor, but also to be adopted by your customer.
Yeah. And in fact, what we looked for and we've seen in a bunch of firms to see if we were being successful is, of course, we see when, someone creates a new account, right? And so we know what their domain is. And so we're like, okay, is that going to be one person? And this has happened in some firms. Like one person picks it up, starts using it, and it doesn't go anywhere. Most of the time, what we see is one person picks it up, 2 days later, somebody else from the same domain creates an account. And we've watched on some customers as it's as they become customers, they start telling us what's going on. And so like we've seen it like start in one city for large firms who are multi-city firms. And then we see it like, oh, it started in Atlanta. Now it's in San Francisco and now it's in New York. And the reason for that is also something that's kind of important in the industry, which is, some time ago, design firms really started to allocate teams according to talent, not necessarily location, depending on the type of the project. And so often what we see in firms is, there's just a multi-city team, usually 3 to 7 people or so who are sharing a project in Hypar. And of course that, will continue on deeper into production as they move on to tools like Revit or, CAD or whatever they're doing. But yeah, so that was one of the early indicators that we were being successful, because in the software world, of course, it comes back to the kind of net promoter score, which we don't really track, but boils down to, would you recommend this to your friend or colleague, right? Which was once characterized as the ultimate question.
Okay.
And so what we see is that happens, right? And so anything that we always think about, like, how do we make it easy for more people to recommend and, adopt if they like it?
Okay, great. Now maybe it seems maybe it's a bit abstract for the people who watch us. So maybe you can share your screen and tell us what is the typical customer journey. So someone who sign up in Hypar, what it do first, and why he should use Hypar.
Okay, hopefully this is coming through. Yep, looks like it is. I'm gonna get this guy out of my way here. Okay, so when you first open Hypar, you have, what you have in a lot of AEC applications, which, infinite fields, show us your genius. What we tried to do here is to make it as easy as possible to get going. So the toolbar on the bottom essentially is, I want to add things to the model, and our basic unit of delivery is a single space.
Okay.
Now you'll notice on the left, we have this pop-up. And what the software is doing is, we don't really know what kind of project you're doing. So we're giving you like a little menu of, maybe you'd like this to be an office, or maybe you'd like it to be a medication room or a lounge. So basically kind of representative types from different sectors. So if I turn this into an office and it gets, furnished thusly, now I've identified as an office, and I'm getting even more suggestions that relate to offices. Some of these are smart. It's easier to see if I go into 2D here, but if I start making this bigger, you'll see that, like, oh, I see, you're not making a private office, you're making an open office, in which case I might want to turn off the walls and maybe do something like that. And then maybe I'm a disciple of Peter Eisenman, and so like I want to do something really designy like this. And now it's trying to adapt to the gesture I just made to try to do something sensible.
But I have two questions. One is, here you started with a cube. So it's because you are working only on that part of the building, or we need to work space by space, room by room?
There are different ways you can work, right? One of the things, like, I started with a room because that's, lets me demo all this kind of stuff. But also, you could start, from creating the building. If we go into 3D here, we start with, and here, let's do this. Let's give it a funny shape. Let's just do that. Maybe we're doing some kind of L-shaped building, and then maybe it's not one story. So let's, select that and grab this guy and make it
Okay.
stories. And so there we go. And in which case, now if maybe we're planning, the first floor of this. And so let's put our open office inside. Maybe we want some different thing here. Let's add maybe we'll add a lounge space in here. And what's happening here is we key in to the name of the space. What we do is behind the scenes, we actually do a statistical analysis of what people name spaces, but we consider their designs proprietary. So we don't really do anything with that. But like I said, we're chock full of architects. So if we see lots of people putting in a lounge, we design a few lounges ourselves and throw them in. But if let's say I put one of these in, for some reason I want 3 next to each other, and I can do stuff like that if I want. But let's say, for example, that, this is almost right, but I really don't want that table there, and I don't want this thing, and I don't want this other thing. Now, if I go into the program on the right here and I drag in another lounge, one of these suggestions is the thing that I just made. So the project gets more intelligent as you go. As you add more and more types and customize them, those become the suggestions that you can use more often. And we see this a lot in the healthcare projects because they design different types of patient rooms depending on where they go in the hospital. And then the architect wants kind of have access to that as a library, and it gets presented here in suggestions.
Okay. So what I understand is that so you only analyze the naming of the room, but you don't use the other architect's data because it's their own data, and you don't want.
Yeah, and well, we only use it in this case that you saw, where we reflect it back in the same project, to anybody who has access to the project, but not beyond.
For the same company, but after second question, if I modify the launch so it enter in the data set, is it shared with the other project in my same company, or is it project by project?
Right now it's project by project. We are talking about doing some kind of reference project feature where you could say, please access this other project from my type. But right now it's copy and paste out of your previous project.
Okay, right. And after you, so this generation process, there is some AI behind that, or it's only more classical generative techniques?
It's actually a combination of both. The AI is kind of suggesting things based on synonyms, for example, of the room names. And also, we're watching, how often different rooms go in and that kind of thing. But essentially, we're using the AI to try to intervene just at the right moment with these suggestions so that you get either some help or not, because we take a basic philosophy that the designer is always right. But we will warn the designer if they're going off their expressed intent. And I can demo what I mean. We don't really build a building like this, like let me add a space and let me add another space. We mostly like bring in a program, right? So if I go searching for this, right, I'll go into healthcare and I'll select some program spreadsheets, and let's select this small hospital. So we don't much care about what the format of an Excel spreadsheet or a CSV is, with a few little caveats in that we're kind of expecting a column will have one type of value. And some of them we automatically recognize. So again, a little AI is happening under here where something that's named something in the neighborhood of department in several languages will get mapped to this column, some kind of like room name or something, but you can also remap these things by hand. So for example, over here, I've deliberately put in things that we don't understand out of the box. So I can map this as a custom property and just add that note. And then, like that, I've just imported, 252 things And it's also hierarchical in terms of these having departments. Now, I said the designer's always right. Now, let me show you in here. There's another deliberate mistake I put in this program. So I open this up, right? And it's got a width of 20, sorry, we're in America, so 20 feet.
No problem.
And depth of 23 feet and an area of 260 feet. And if you quickly do the math in your head, like, that's not right. But you're the designer.
Okay. Yeah, because it could be the surface, which is good, but not the width.
Right. So we just flag it with this little yellow outline. And if you hover over it, we tell you these things don't add up. So up to you what you want to do about it. So similarly, in a feature that we have coming that's not released yet, let's say I'm just going to grab this desk and put it out here, make it a little clearer to see. So this is not an unreleased feature. It's coming out in a couple of weeks, called clearances. And if we look at this in 3D, let's move over here and get on the other side of the building. Where'd you go, guy? Yep, I lost my furniture. All right, let's just bring this for a map here. We'll just make a copy. Let's bring him here. Let's grab this desk. Okay, so let's add a clearance here, right? And so now we've got this guy. And we can set him up here. Let's be courtesy to the European customers, switch to Imperial. And let's say we need a 1 meter clearance by this desk, and that travels with it. Now, let's say I have another desk here, and I'm going to take this guy and turn him. And you see, as soon as the clearances intersect, it lights up. Now, we've asked a lot of designers, how do you resolve? Well, first, how do you detect clashes? And then how do you resolve them? And they say, well, we stare at a drawing for a really long time to see if any of the dotted lines overlap. So we thought maybe we can do better. And, let's see, it's pre-release, so it's not always warning, but we do that. And what we're working on right now is what happens here, right? So the next step on this, which is one of the reasons we haven't released it, I want to tell the model that this particular overlap is fine and stop turning it red on me.
Okay, so a human designer can tell, okay, there is no issue for me about that.
Right. That's the idea.
But that specific clash, not all.
Yes, that's really important. It's that specific clash, not any clash.
Yeah.
So that way, if you have, and especially we see this, with handicap accommodation regulations, it's the ADA in the US, it has different names around the world, but, often the wheelchair turning radius, it's fine to overlap with other clearances.
Okay.
Sometimes in the manufacturing sector, it's really not fine if a clearance around a piece of machinery or a piece of lab equipment is impeded by some other object or some other clearance. So you have to have that capability to say, yes, this clearance is okay, this one isn't. But again, it comes back to the designer's expertise on what to permit.
Okay.
You start out from the point of view of nothing is permitted except what the designer says is okay.
Okay. And by the way, you talked about regulation. Do you take into account the US regulation in Hypar? Or?
We've gotten a lot of requests, depending on the venue of the customer, are your rooms compliant to X standard, right? And so, for example, we've incorporated in some of our room types a lot of the U.S. Veterans Administration standards, because they're my taxpayer dollars, among others, paid to make a big public resource for that. The Australian government has one of these as well. Some governments have made these kind of things public. So we get a lot of requests for, in the US, for example, can you give me something that's FGI compliant, the Facilities Guideline Institute?
Okay.
Which is more, less generous than the VA's allocation of space.
Yeah.
We haven't done that yet, but We might be going down that road depending on what happens. At the moment, there are firms that have their own standards. And one thing we've done is make it possible for them to bring in what they've created before in Revit. So I'm going to select this and get my toolbar out of the way. And then
So here you're demonstrating also the connection between Revit and Hypar.
Yeah. Yeah, so I'm sending, this is if you have room types. Right now I'm taking a room type in Revit and sending it up to Hypar. Now we don't have to like sit here and watch it process as it gets ready. What we can do is go back into Hypar because we're going to get a warning that there's something ready to be placed in here when it's.
It is a one-way connection or a synchronization?
No, it's not. It's not synchronization, but it is a two-way connection.
Two-way connection.
You can load a project from Hypar into Revit.
Mm-hmm.
Here, we'll make a simple project because otherwise it'll take a little time. But there's our placement. Hold on. Let's place our space first.
Okay.
So there it is. Now, these are still Revit families. So why don't we just round trip this guy here? And this is all editable, right? I could still move these around and, rotate them and do this kind of thing. So let's make something, kind of noticeably different. And then we'll come back to this project and I'll show you some other stuff. I'll make a copy of the chair. Okay. So something kind of different from the space we brought in. If we go back to Revit, we'll close this box. Let's open up a new file. And hang on, I'm going to pop back into Hypar just so I can find this project again by giving it a name. Here, let's say future architecture. Revit. So if we go back to the add-in and load a project, let's give it a second until it refreshes its list to future architecture, and then start bringing it back in. So, so the more, technical among your viewers will understand, there's a linear relationship between unique numbers, unique families, and how long this process takes, because we have to load all that stuff in. If you have, 200 of the same chair, it's not much longer than one of the same chair.
Okay.
So it goes by family.
But it could last some time if the project is a bit big, is what you said, no?
Yeah. And that's I'm doing a very short one here to, save your viewers processing time. But here we've got our space. It's all still Revit families and it's all still editable. So what we envision is that because it's so easy to push stuff around in Hypar at early stages of the design, we tend to do things like this and things that just are very hard to do in Revit because it's very construction document oriented. We see this Hypar being used at the moment, like into DD stages, design development stages. And at some point, you're going to want to start producing something that starts looking like construction documents. Probably want to move it into Revit at that point and then carry on from there. But what we find is a lot of designers see this as a communication tool when they're bringing clients to decisions, because they can do things like this and just like jump in and have clients look around and say, yeah, that kind of looks like the sort of room I want or not.
Is it possible to invite the architect customer in the platform?
Yeah, there's a couple of ways to do it.
Okay.
You can share the project as a viewer or an editor in this way. And any of our subscribing customers also get a little extra here of a viewer access where they can just copy a link and like stick in an email and send it.
Okay.
Someone still has to make an account, but this is kind of a quick facility for subscribers to send it to a client review.
So it's free for them if they want to invite to as many people as they want.
Yes. Yeah, to view, to look to view. And, for trials, people can make up to 3 projects before we start.
Okay, great. So it's possible to try before buying, which is
Absolutely.
I think.
There are things that won't be readily accessible. We're starting to actually release subscriber only features. So the link feature I just showed you is not readily available, and options are not available. So clearances will also be a paid feature. There'll be a few things. I think our CTO this morning, Matt Campbell, was just talking about releasing the visibility of options to the free users, and probably at this point we'll tell you like, hey, you should subscribe to Hypar.
Yeah,
We're trying that kind of stuff out.
But so I understand that you Hypar is a tool specialized for space planning and for early stage design, which you don't. It will not replace Revit. It will complete Revit in the early stages.
Yeah, so I'm not sure how much you dug into my LinkedIn, but I ran Revit for 8 years as the director of product management at for AEC at Autodesk. Revit is excellent at creating coordinated construction documents. It's what it was designed for. It's what people asked for. Every other use was kind of bolted onto it afterwards, and people really struggle kind of at the earlier design stages unless they're very, very good at Revit.
Okay.
To use it as a design tool, because it's really designed for construction documents, not design. Now, we had an experience with one of our biggest customers where we were first introducing the tool to them. He gave us to a bunch of really good Revit users. And afterwards, the reaction was, why would we use this? We're very good at Revit. And we're all like, why did you have us talk to this group? And he said, no. Those are the people that are really good with Revit. Now I'm going to take you to the people who are bad at Revit. And that's the group that adopted. In this particular firm, they have a whole asset management group. Have to do each designer ends up doing like 3 office test fits a week. And so they're just really going very, very fast all the time. And they don't really have time to deal or a need for a full-blown BIM in Revit. They're really just trying to bring a client to a decision point where they can say, yes, I see that I can fit 350 people in this building on that level. Let's go ahead with a real design for the project, which they will do up to a point in Hypar and then bring it to Revit for completion to construction documents.
Okay. And you have also the option feature, which allow to design various options in parallel.
So let's say this, was our minor option here. And then what we want to do is just add an option, right? And what we do is we just duplicate that first project for you. So if I take these out, then you can just kind of toggle, between them, this option, that option.
Okay.
And we went down this road first rather than a comparison, a side-by-side comparison road, because we heard from some designers that they would show side-by-side comparisons to clients who are not used to looking at plans, let's say. And the client will be seeing, looking at the comparison and say, wait, now what's the difference between these two now? Can you, because they're just not used to that sort of visualization.
Okay.
And so a few designers said, so what we do is we set them up in PowerPoint to do this, and they can just see the differences happen. And then they go, oh, I get it. And so this
you mean that by showing one after the other, it's more easy for the customer to identify the changes?
Much clearer to the client because they can see stuff, change, and they're not doing one of these things is not like the other comparison when they're not used to looking at that.
But maybe the comparison of data of the surfaces, or it's
useful. So probably easier to see if we go here. I'm going to bring that program I had back in, because one of the things we do, and let's throw a few of these in here. I'm just going to throw this and this and this. Let's actually bring in the whole department and stick them in there. And see, we change the visuals there to tell you you're now working inside a department. So that becomes a whole unit. And let's say I'm not actually going to talk to the nurses who are running things, but I'm going to talk to the hospital administrator. These folks, they live in spreadsheets. So let's export that and open it up. And so what we do is report here. And here, let's enable editing so we get the deviation too.
Mm.
So this is the original stuff required. Right? This tells I only placed 3 spaces. And what were the spaces placed? What's my total area? How much am I deviating from what the program said? And we just heard from a lot of designers, like, this is what the administrators want to see. And a lot of times what happens is architects, space planners, they'll get a program, and, a good one is like the cardiac operating room, right? And they'll offer, like, our program has the cardiac room, it has all these other spaces. And the architect, which is why they hire them, who's experienced in making these facilities, realizes they've left out 5 spaces that they absolutely need to make all that work, because they're so used to seeing them, they don't remember them. So what often the conversation they have to have with the administrator is, your cardiac unit is up by 20%. And they're like, why? Because they know, area equals cost. Like, why is it bigger? Like, well, and then they tell the story through the spreadsheet, because these 5 spaces were not included in the original program. They have to be this big. That's why it is. And then they can have the real business discussion of, what should we shrink to make this work? And we've seen architects have shared things with us, like in that notes column I talked about. Well, they'll, in meetings, like, write down things like, can shrink 10% for patient services. And that'll typically be like a record section, doctor's offices, whatever. And one of the reasons we put that way to include the notes in there is because we heard a lot of stories from folks that, if we, let's see, one of these has them.
Yes, so you still leave a space for the human to interact with the software. It's your philosophy.
And so actually that's kind of a good tangent to follow, because a lot of folks basically approach us knowing some of the previous work we've done and say, well, can it just do it for me? And our experience in the kind of total floor layout was that we would extensively interview experts in a firm. We would produce an algorithm that gave them something like a Pareto front about, like, here are the 6 factors that you care about. These are very performant. These various designs are performative. And then they would tell us that, well, this is good, but I had to, move 60% of the floor plan around. And we were like, why did you have to move 60% of the floor plan around? And they would say, oh, because on this project, there are 4 more factors. And then we realized that these kind of algorithms are this kind of eternal chase.
Yeah, I would have liked to ask you this question. So it's it's a good point that you mentioned it, because I was, as you demoed the placement of room, I was thinking, is there a way to auto place the room with the corridor and so on? But you say it's not possible really to have a good algorithm for that.
It's not that it's not possible. It's that we find it's not satisfactory.
Okay.
So, like, for example, the sharing thing I was showing you, if I drag another pharmacy in, now it's starting to also remember the layout of the last pharmacy and suggest that as something that I could do, right?
Okay.
So it's not totally not, uncognizant of understanding, at this level as well, and trying to offer you back suggestions in that regard. But we just found that there were so many factors that designers were holding in their heads that were very difficult to record and incorporate in a prioritized manner, that we actually wanted to pull the needle all the way back to kind of helping the designer along the way, rather than giving them something to fix. There is a philosophy there, and we talk about this with designers all the time. For example, we have one customer who saw one of the text to BIM things, and we were the first people to do one like 3 years ago. And she was like, this is really compelling. And I said to this customer, like, how long would you work on that prompt to try to get it right Before it was just easier just to draw what you meant. And he was like, okay, well, there's that. So we just found that if you started incorporating all the generative factors that people actually cared about, you started to end up with design roulette, because there might be one or two people in the firm who'd really understand that if I move the sliders like this and this and this, and I check this box, yeah, I'll get the right thing. Everybody else would be like, I don't know, maybe if I put the slider over here, I'll get something I can use.
Yeah, I understand.
You can do it. And we've worked with a modular company, for example, where it's a highly constrained problem, right? There's only a certain amount of types of modules. There's a certain mix of modules they want on any given project, and there are only certain layouts they'll accept. Highly constrained problems like that, you can absolutely generate, conclusions from that are useful. The typical project is not that highly constrained, but you do see it in things like multifamily residential. It can be very highly constrained, depending on, but usually in a modular context. So, but we're not saying that, generated solutions are bad and in any way, because there are certain constrained problems where they're excellent.
It would be strange, contrary, because you are known for this generative design. So if you would say it is bad,
so we have. I like to say is like, we started down this road in comparison to most startups about 2 years before a lot of folks did. And so we went down a lot of these paths to see what was possible and what isn't. We found, or I shouldn't say what's possible, what is practical, what is useful, and what isn't. We found, especially in engineering systems, which are complex but constrained, you can absolutely generate entire systems. We've done cabling systems, we've done roof drainage systems, we've done structural systems for people, and all that works great. Once you start getting into where the humans are interacting all the time, like the spaces, it starts to get more artistic.
Yeah, architecture is not that not so deterministic as engineering system.
Exactly. Certain types of architecture can be. Like, we still kind of hold to the idea that, in America, we have our little corner strip malls a lot. Like, those are mathematical problems. They're not really design problems. There's a certain, ratio of rent to area they want to get. There are certain regulations that govern the setbacks and the parking. It's almost a deterministic problem in that case. And so you see some companies like attacking kind of narrow sectors like that and producing, quite viable solutions that can do certain answers.
I'm thinking about the IKEA kitchen, for example, which is also pretty standardized. So it's possible in that case to generate.
Yeah. And in fact, here, I'll show you something from a bespoke job where I'm allowed to show you, since you bring up kitchens. So that's a highly constrained problem. So, for example, we did this for one customer who manufactures cabinets, and they said 90% of our projects are linear kitchens. We just want something for the salespeople to be able to move the appliances around according to the way the customer works, and then just generate a linear kitchen solution with our cabinets that then we can just, export something and feed that into our machinery to make the cabinets, and off it goes.
Okay.
So we did a little project, like that. And as you say, these kind of constrained things, my kitchen is a little shorter. You can generate solutions for pretty easily, because the whole problem space is limited, right? But once you start getting into, large buildings with a, mix of services that might be changing, it gets harder. So we had one conversation with architects. We brought them in to do some, pre-release testing. And they're kind of in the middle, and somebody comes in and murmurs something to one of them, and the two architects start laughing. We're like, what happened? And they said, our 4-story hospital is now a 2-story hospital.
Yeah.
I said, did they change the program? And they said, a little. So obviously, this is a real human judgment design problem when something like that happens, because you start digging into the value system of the project, which is difficult to capture ad hoc in code. Because this is what we look to designers to do, right? They're creating, helping the client create a value system around the project. What is important? Highest return on area. What is important? Cancer rates go down in Charlotte, North Carolina. I mean, there's goals, there's different goals for different projects, and they have different entities depending on the client. That is a very difficult thing to make a universal tool to capture, which is really why we rely on designers. They are the universal tool to try to capture that value system and express it in building. That doesn't mean we can't keep helping them, right? The stuff I'm showing you with the suggestions that come up on the left, that's kind of just the beginning. There's lots of things we can suggest. We're thinking in the future that, building systems, as we've found, are more deterministic, right? Once I start having room layouts, well, I kind of start to know how sprinklers go together, and I kind of know how the electrical has to go in. And so we foresee building upon this foundation into other disciplines in the future.
Okay, I understand. But I see two use cases that to me are not maybe possible. One is to allow with a prompt system or with sharing an image, for example, of what you want. For example, if a designer draw a sketch of the layout you want, share an image, and maybe you can interpret the image so that it is the designer who decide, but you make it real, more.
Interpreting an image is actually kind of fun. Val, we've actually done a project like that, which I'll show you for Obayashi. If you had like a designer sketch today that you'd done in, I guess anything, including a scanned piece of paper. One of the things you could do is, grab, let's say, I don't know, we've got kind of a loose concept here. Right now, this is an image, so we don't know how big everything is. So we give you, this little ruler here.
1 meter.
Let's go to metric and say, maybe that's 2.8 meters or something.
Yes.
And then it scales the whole thing, and now we can start, doing a layout inside that. So that may be one way to do the sketch. Now, as far as interpreting things goes, so we did a bespoke project for Obayashi a few years ago. It's kind of our first AI project that we had done, where and this was dreamed up in a bar in Las Vegas during Autodesk University, where the Obayashi, the head of design, said, we had this business where we put up speculative office towers in Tokyo. And one of the things we would really like to do is go around the neighborhood and take photographs of the nearby buildings so we can show the regulatory authorities that, yes, our building will fit in to this area, so you should permit it. So this is something that they've used internally and talk about publicly as AI Corb, we named it. But it's on top of the Hypar platform where they drag in a photo, and then we do an analogous facade based on that photo.
Okay. So you interpret the photo to make a drawing.
Yeah. So this is an AI underneath. We worked with Obayashi and Stanford Research Institute on this, and we share a patent on this, where you can just bring in these arbitrary photographs of buildings. Now, you could probably bring in any arbitrary photograph. I'm not exactly sure everything it'll do. It'll still look like a facade. But, originally the folks involved were saying, well, why can't you just take a photograph of the building and paste it, on the side of the building? We said, that's boring. Let's actually generate a real 3D facade that you can quantify. So all this stuff is possible, and, it's contextual as to whether it's meaningful.
So what I understand is that you have a common platform which everybody can use even for free. And after you have some projects that you make for companies to customize the behavior of Hypar to exactly what they want for big clients, I suppose.
Yeah. So what we did is we spent a few years doing these kind of projects to basically stretch the platform to many different use cases. And now, like our customers who are working on that side, they just use it on their own. They license use of the platform and develop their own vertical applications. So we've seen people do siphonic drainage systems and department layouts in hospitals and residential layouts and those kind of things. And we have other folks who are just starting to leverage some of the text to BIM work we've done before to try to generate buildings from text. But mostly, our team is focused on the space planning vertical that I've been showing you.
Okay. So,
And
there is a plugin system inside Hypar that we can leverage to make our own app, a plugin system.
there is a plugin system, and what we do is we generally point customers at some of our partners to use that system to make their custom software.
Okay.
Generally speaking, we're looking to migrate that platform eventually into this environment, so you get all the nice interaction, but that's something for the future.
Okay. And do you envision having a sort of app store inside of Hypar where a publisher can publish their own plugin to the community, maybe?
I mean, yeah, it's certainly an obvious move, and we have talked about it in the past. So far, it's been hard to fully justify doing something like that. So because most of the development we see is focused back in on the entity doing the development rather than, and I was at a conference where one person in a very large firm said to me that the executives approached him and said, well, we'd really like to, sell this stuff you and your group have been working on. And he was like, okay, we have to have a full-time team. People can't be pulled back into projects. We need somebody to do marketing. We need to do somebody to do support. We need this and that. And the executives were like, well, maybe we won't do that right now. Because, it's basically when you want to do something like that, you have to become a software company and you are a design company. And those are very, consulting and.
You mean the companies who developed plugins, they are not really willing to share their plugin, or they don't want to take the time, even if it is not for free.
Yeah, I mean, whether they're willing or not, what they generally focus on primarily is increasing the efficiency and quality of their own operations first.
Okay.
It's never a trivial endeavor to do something like that, because it involves a very deep understanding and support of the processes. And, frankly, what you find as you dig into processes in firms is they're not universal inside the firm, and they're generally a little, kind of squishy. I mean, software doesn't like squishy very much. And that's why we found the approach is much more highly successful, as we've been talking about in engineering, where it's much more deterministic.
Okay.
Than in building design, which is more artistic.
Okay, great. So now I see the time which is passing, and I have two more questions at least. One is about open source, because you started with saying that you started with an open source software. So do you still maintain this open source software, and how it is used by Hypar currently?
Yeah. So I should be clear. The Hypar platform itself is not open source. The elements library that makes all this stuff go is.
Okay.
So all the representations of every little piece of modeling in here has an analogy into the elements library. And so we use it to represent building components. That's what elements is, essentially. It's also extensible. So people have taken it and added, their own elements to it. They're free to either contribute them back, which has happened a couple of times, to the open library, or keep it proprietary if they like, which happens more often.
Like it.
And That's the open source part. And yes, we support it. And if people submit things to Elements, we review them. It's very similar to how Linux works. There's a group of people that, review submissions and decide whether to put them in the main library or leave them off on their own branch because they're not entirely compatible, perhaps.
Okay, but it's already very, very good that one of the main component of your software is open source and you still use it and maintain it. I think it's a very good.
Yeah. And you don't have to use it on Hypar. It's a C# library. So we have people who use it inside of Revit add-ins. We have people who use it inside their own software. But there's nothing that ties it right into our services. Our services will take advantage of Elements, but people have used it as a lightweight representation of building components, which frankly, we originally did not want to write. We were kind of hoping to find one that was already in use.
Yeah.
But IFC, for a variety of technical reasons, wasn't quite suitable for web applications in our view. And the couple other candidates that were out there were either proprietary, poorly maintained, or both.
And
so
did you identify IFC.js, IFC, or now it is called that open company? Do you have any relation between the two projects? Or
No. We've done IFC export in the past, and now we're just starting to get some requests for IFC compatibility, both in and out. And we'll see if that rises to the level of priority.
okay,
Yeah. But so far, our customers have been pretty happy with the Revit download. And then if they need to go out from IFC from there or into Inkscape or whatever, they're pretty happy to use Revit as the kind of hub for that. But who knows what the future brings.
Okay, so it's a kind of generator of element of construction, element of furniture, and this kind of stuff.
Yeah. Room, element, space, furniture, beam, all these kind of basic building elements are available in there. So.
Okay, great. And my second question is related to the other software that to me seems a bit related to yours, like for example Snaptrude or maybe Finch. How do you compare with these two tools?
Snaptrude is kind of like the more generalized tool, I would say. And so we kind of keep focusing right in on a particular workflow until we get all the details right. They're trying to make, in my view anyway, Ashraf may have a different point of view, but it looks like, they're kind of making a generalized design tool. We're focused on a very, tight area where we want to support more than that. And I'm sorry, the other one you mentioned, Finch
3D?
Yeah. And to my knowledge, Finch has been kind of exclusively focused on multifamily residential, which
Yeah, it's true.
yeah, we looked at that early on. We've done a couple of multifamily residential software projects for bespoke customers. It seemed like a very popular field, and commercial architecture was not so much being directly supported. So we decided to go and support the kind of commercial building side first. Not that you can't do residential in Hypar. You could build, your rooms and everything. We're starting to look at hospitality, for example.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, they're very much into generate a fast floor plan according to a bunch of factors and go from there.
Yeah.
We're much more design interactive in that regard.
And finally, what kind of architecture practice are interested or are clients of Hypar? Do you have a pattern that you identified?
We found we're mostly right now in the sectors of workplace, healthcare. We're starting to get pulled into labs in recent months. And then we have, a few outliers who are doing kind of residential projects and that kind of thing. Since it's free to trial, people are, jumping in and then telling us all about, this other kind of project they're doing. So there's a few, single family residential folks who are doing their planning in. We didn't specifically go and support that, but people seem to like the ease of the UI, and so they tend to bring in their own projects.
You have even some non-professionals that use Hypar, like to design their home, or no?
We have been in contact with some users who are saying, like, we'll get one thing Hypar doesn't do right now is like pitched roofs. So as soon as somebody says, can you add pitched roofs? We know they're probably doing a single family residential project.
Okay.
Or they show us eventually, it's like, this is what I'm trying to work on.
Okay.
But a lot of them find the floor plan is perfectly fine.
Okay. And as an architect, what it costs to subscribe to Hypar, and what they can do in the free plan? Can they use it really for true project, or need to try with the free version?
Currently, the trial will support 3 projects. And after that, it's $25 per named user per month, or $250 US for the year. We have a bunch of other plans as well for kind of more enterprise customers who are buying in volume.
Okay,
that's something that we talk about with them.
Great. Maybe you can stop your screen sharing, so we can. Yeah, great. I see my camera is not perfect. It's autofocus. So yeah, so it's all right. No issue. Yeah. So how do you see the future of Hypar and the future of this kind of software in general? Because I see many software a bunch of software that try to make the early design stage easier for architects. And to me, there is an ecosystem of software around Revit. Revit will not change so much in the future, but I see many new actors like you who try to change the design. And how do you see your place in this ecosystem, and how it will change in the next years?
Well, I mean, at the beginning, we're going to just kind of reach probably deeper and deeper into design development phases, prior to construction document phasing, but also probably trying to support multiple disciplines and more sectors. We just find that every time we start talking to a designer in a different sector, like we started with healthcare because we thought it was the hardest to support. And we thought, if we can support healthcare, you can support anything. And we started getting into labs and discovering that they had kind of different requirements. And so it's just been fascinating that even inside a big firm that does many different types of buildings, like each of those groups is almost like its own firm, because they've got their own expertise, their own clients. They've got a very particular way of working, which is matched to their client needs. And so where we think we're going is, just kind of expanding out into more sectors with this kind of workflow. But we'll probably also be following behind with the older ones that we feel like we're supporting very well for architecture, and start bringing in other disciplines later to have coordinated models. Because we found out, to our surprise, that not only were architects using Bluebeam for space planning, so that's like one of our major competitors, to our surprise, but that engineers were also using Bluebeam. And we're like, for what? And they're like, well, we have a mechanical room and we have the shafts, we have to lay them out, and we know what kind of size we need. And so in the early stages, we're just moving the color forms around a lot like the architects are. So we think there's a lot of room in the early stages of a project when you're doing this kind of multidiscipline coordination to even bring in, the engineers without necessarily generating complete engineering systems. So we think there's a whole pathway for Hypar to start bringing in more and more of the team in the early stages and taking them to a point where they're satisfied with the design and then need to document it in Revit.
Okay, I understand. So you are still focused on space planning, and you want to expand the possibilities of Hypar for many different disciplines, one at a time. So you fit exactly to what they need, and you are not a generalist.
Yeah, and really to support a sector. One thing that I've come up upon recently is like a whole universe of the dealer designers in furniture. right? And that's an interesting group, right? They have to stay up with the spec of the manufacturer's furniture, but they also help out with deploying that furniture into a design. So working with the architect, right? And so it's a whole layer of professionals that frankly I didn't even know existed until recently, but there's a lot of them and they have annual conventions, and so like this is a whole sector that we don't really know much about inside conventional, what we think about of types of projects. And so the idea that anybody can jump into a piece of software and quickly start working with space really came through with one firm we're working with. They have on staff a nurse practitioner who advises the healthcare architects on how spaces need to go together to support nurses. And we had her took her 10 minutes because she never touched any kind of design software before that. 10 minutes, she started designing in Hypar, and she said, finally, I can show the designers what I mean, not just hand wave at them and try to explain. And for us, that's a great moment because that's like taking someone who doesn't have the building expertise of letting her express the requirements of the project to someone who does in a way that person will understand. And it's super gratifying when we can do stuff like that.
Okay. And about AI, as on that channel, I talk often about AI. Do you plan to use it more, to integrate in the product more?
We do, and we want to make it very much focused back onto the firm who's using it, because what we hear a lot, especially from senior people in firms, is that they're always concerned with conserving the intellectual history and value inside the firm, especially as they get close to retirement. They think, who's going to take over for me? And right now, as always in the profession, we use an apprenticeship model, which is truly medieval, to actually try to conserve the institutional memory of firm. And so what we foresee is people being able to use tools like Hypar that actually start conserving it for that firm. So the next time somebody does some kind of similar project, the system itself says, this is how you have done it in the past. Because we also hear from some design firms with their clients that the client will say something like, we haven't done a chemistry lab on the campus in 10 years. What are people doing now in chemistry labs? They want to know what is happening, among their peers, and the designer is the locus of that. And the designer needs the references out to what are we doing with chem labs the last 10 years? So we think that there's a lot of value when things aren't buried in a Revit model that's kind of hard to find and access, that having some kind of web-based repository that is forthcoming, let us say, with past work has a high degree of value to firms that would like to conserve and deliver their institutional knowledge to their people.
So it will be an extension of Hypar to provide this repository of project.
I mean, it's starting to do it already, right? It's just a matter of kind of making the connection stronger inside the firm. And so we see firms doing things like making, a master project, which basically is just a library of the rooms that they like from previous projects. And then they'll start a new project using that as the template where they have all their room types and they start reassembling and then adjusting, for the particular project. But, that's a form of institutional memory. And, I've been chasing something like this since I was a young architect. And I realized that, I would mature as a professional when I hit 40. And then I would be trusted with some decisions sometimes. And I was like, 20 years seems like a really long time to get trusted by something. I started thinking, I wonder if technology would help me with this in the future. And so
I have an anecdote to finish, but personally, I was working in an architecture company in the 2006, something like this. It was my last experience in architecture, and I auto assigned me the work to collect all the details of the practice to put it in. So I did some an AutoCAD where I put all the detail. And I exported it to some PDF, but it's not a very convenient way to reuse. You can see the work, but it's not directly reusable in other projects. It was kind of difficult to reuse it. But I was also aware of this problem in my practice. They were always using the same details for their projects. So why not saving time by reusing, improving them, and so on?
Well, and building on that anecdote, one of the things that has happened in the US in the past is, as hurricanes hit Florida, in some of them, the roofs got ripped right off homes. And a lot of times that was because they weren't using the standard detail down there, which has strapping around the rafter to hold it down, not just up from the wind. And that's a standard detail you want suggested to you when you're doing something. So we're not there yet, but this is the kind of implicit knowledge that is so critical to the designer. And there's no reason that technology shouldn't help them access it and include it in their project.
Yes, and in context, when you are designing, you have a suggestion, because if it is not in context, you rely on people. Okay, I remember that there is something to do.
Right. And so much of this expertise is folklore, right? Because it's not in the licensing tests, right? A lot of stuff is, but everything isn't. And so, I did a project when I was working with EYP, and it had been designed by an architect in the Southwest United States and was to be built in Massachusetts. And I took a glance at it, and the first thing I said is, okay, all the ice is going to slide off that roof and right onto that entrance stairway. And where do people put their coats? And where do people cater? And I had all these things that were dependent on a very interior winter design, when it had been designed by architects who are used to it's sunny desert weather all the time. People don't have a place to put coats. There's no ice. The caterers can set up outside in the tent. We were like,
Understand. Okay, so thank you very much, Anthony. It was a great pleasure to discuss with you and to understand at the end what is Hypar and how it is different from the other software. Do you want to have a conclusion for my YouTube follower, or what do you want to tell them?
Yeah, sure. Look, I would say don't just look at technology for the wow factor. It's so important to think about how it integrates into practice. And the practice is the important thing to understand before you try to bring technology into it. And you can't ask enough questions. There's always some nuance that you can find if you go back in and start talking to the people who are practicing every day. And every time you do that, if you're a technology developer, your technology will get better because your understanding is deeper.
Okay, it's great. It's very linked to the fact, to me, that AI, at first, it was like a boom of only a wow factor. People wanted to test everything, but now they ask themselves what we are going to use effectively, what is really important, which tool to choose. So I think now many architecture companies are asking this question. And we are coming to an edge more of realism. Okay, AI is great, but why we need it, and what it will solve, what kind of problem it will solve?
Yeah. And I think that's really important, right? And it's good to understand what you want the result to be before you start applying technology.
Yeah.
Right. Like how do we do it now? How can it be better?
Yeah. What is the problem, and how can I solve it with AI or other type of technique? No matter, it's the problem. The important is to solve the problem, to make our designer life better, let's say.
Right. Yeah. Keep in mind, everybody should keep in mind the technology is here for us. We're not here for it.
Great. Thank you very much, Anthony, and see you soon. And to my follower, see you in the next video. In this channel, I talk about AI in IFC, and I interview a founder of software like Hypar that work on changing the way we design as an architect. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody.